Hey everyone, welcome to this special edition of my car review series, where we're going over everything you need to know about the Mark IV Toyota Supra in Forza Horizon 4. Let's start with a bit of history on the car itself. The Supra is probably the most universally known Japanese sports car, serving as an icon of the tuner scene, but its beginnings were pretty humble. The Supra was originally nothing more than a sport trim for the late 70s Toyota Celica, equipped with an inline-6 instead of the 4-cylinder that came standard. But after 8 years in 1986, it broke free of the Celica name, becoming its own car in the form of the A70, commonly called the Mark III Supra. It was in this generation that the Supra started to build its reputation. It finally looked like a real sports car now, and it drove like one too, offering adjustable suspension, advanced ABS, and an optional turbocharged 3-liter inline-6 engine based off the 2000 GT. The 7M GTE engine was phenomenal for the time, and was the last in Toyota's line of flagship M engines. But what replaced it was oh so much better. The 1JZ. This engine was stronger and faster than its predecessor and quickly gained reputation among tuners for being one of the cheapest and easiest engines to modify. The A70 Supra was now a force to be reckoned with and was really starting to catch the public's eye, but Toyota wasn't done yet. In 1993, the A80, or Mark IV Supra, was launched with a majorly revamped body style, lighter chassis, and an even better version of their engine, the 2JZ. Everything good about the 1J was even better in the 2J, and since the two engines were so similar, tuners were fast to push the 2JZ to its limits, realizing it could handle upwards of 800 horsepower before needing upgraded internals. That was essentially unheard of for the time. The model we have in Forza here is the 1998 Supra RZ, the highest trim model and last year of the Supra in the global market. This model has the updated 6-speed transmission and 2JZ with VVTi, and really is the best of the best when it comes to Supras. This car skyrocketed the Japanese tuner scene into the mainstream, landing starring roles in movies like Fast and Furious, where the Supra sports a Bomex body kit that you can mostly replicate in Forza. So let's end our history lesson here and talk more about what we can do to our Supra in Horizon 4. We've got a whole host of body kit options back from Horizon 3, and happily we have track width adjustment now too. This Supra comes standard with twin turbos, but you can, if you want, switch to a big single for a more aggressive power band and higher peak power. Engine swaps are available, but you should know that the 2JZ single turbo can be pushed over 1600 horsepower, and it sounds beautiful, so I would suggest keeping it. Besides that, we have our full array of suspension and tire options, and the car can be tuned from B-Class all the way up to the top of S1 while remaining rear-wheel drive. So, let's start by taking the bone stock Supra out for a spin to see how it handles, and I'll be quiet for a second so you can hear the engine. So you will hopefully agree with me that Forza did pretty well with the engine sounds here. It definitely is one of my personal favorites. And the Supra handles great out of the box too. Even though its stock form sits in B-Class, it still feels really fast. It corners well, drives smooth, and maintains quite a bit of grip. The one issue I'm feeling is that there's definitely some body roll and chassis flex at play here, but luckily those are easily tuned out. So let's head back to the shop and build a few tunes for our Supra. We'll start with a top of B-Class driver's tune. This build won't focus heavily on competitive racing, but instead will be more of a nice cruiser car and meant to embody the spirit of the stock Supra, but with a few light mods and tuning tweaks to maximize performance without changing the stock feel. I'll go ahead and show the tuning numbers above here while I'm talking about the build, so you can build the tune yourself and adjust it as you see fit. I do still consider these tunes to be rough drafts, so they could use some more fine-tuning and tweaking. Anyways, for our B-Class build, I focused mostly on unlocking tuning options and didn't increase the power because it's already pretty high for a B-Class car. So we do have the race springs, unlocked anti-roll bars, as well as the max unlocked differential, but we have left stock tire compound and stock tire width. We have though increased the track width to help a bit with grip, and gone with some lighter rims. For the tune itself, we've stayed relatively close to the stock numbers in most areas. A few exceptions to this are the camber, which we've largely reduced because the default race camber is far too high for a B-Class car, as well as stiffening the suspension. This is actually the stiffest suspension out of all of our builds today, and that's for a few reasons. For one, this build is not as low as any of our other builds, so I wanted to compensate for that by increasing the stiffness of the suspension a bit, just to keep that body roll to a minimum. Another reason is that we haven't added any chassis reinforcement, so a stiffer suspension will help the vehicle feel more responsive. This is also the heaviest of our builds without any weight reduction, so we'll need stiffer spring rates to compensate for that extra weight. And the final reason is a bit silly, but it's personal preference. When I think of amateur tuner cars, I think of overly stiff suspension. And since this build isn't really focused on being a serious competitive race car, it's more about a driver's car and giving a realistic kind of tuner feel car, I feel like having that over stiff suspension just from some cheap coilovers that were never properly tuned, gives a more authentic feel to the build. With all of that said though, this car drives really well. It's probably actually my favorite B-Class on-road car. It has 320 horsepower and feels great. It's fast for a B-Class car, and it doesn't feel heavy. That stiff suspension and the few tweaks we've made to things like alignment really make the car feel snappy and responsive, and for a rear-wheel drive build with a good bit of horsepower on stock tires, you really don't have to manage the throttle that much either. Since the power band is so smooth and the stock tires are honestly pretty wide, it just grips through corners. And that's just about it for this B-Class driver's build. Of course, all of these tunes will be shared, so you can just go ahead and quick download them if you want to try them without having to copy all the numbers, but I do want to leave the numbers there so you can replicate the build and of course adjust it how you see fit. And with that said, let's move on to our A-Class build. For this setup, I want to focus a bit more on power while maintaining enough grip to keep the car easily drivable. I want this car to be competitive in Rivals or online, but not necessarily a chart topper. For mods, you can see we've added some visual customization as well as the Forza front splitter to give us some downforce tuning, but I have kept the stock rear wing. We've also gone up a few tire compounds into sport as well as widened the tires overall. Beyond that, pretty much all of this car has been upgraded in some form. We have fully upgraded brakes, the sport weight reduction, some chassis reinforcement, as well as light power mods to bring the total power up to 410 horsepower. To accomplish this, we've upgraded things like exhaust and the cams. For the tune itself, we are starting to stray from the stock tune values, but not too far from the inspiration of the B-Class build. Our alignment is more aggressive, and our suspension has been adjusted all around to compensate for different weight balance, overall car weight, and lower ride height. We've also had to shift our tune more towards being understeer prone in order to prevent the car from being too oversteer happy with this added power. As for how the car feels, it's great. This is my favorite build of the 4 we've got today. The car is even more responsive than before, and we've managed to wrangle in the extra power really well. I did leave the car with a bit of oversteer tendency in order to increase the amount of turn-in and help with that responsive feeling, so there's a bit of throttle management you have to do here, but it's honestly one of the easiest cars I've ever driven in terms of throttle management. Like I was saying earlier, the power band is just so smooth, and now that we've widened the tires, the loss of grip and ability to regain grip is really smooth and really easy to manage. The long wheelbase compared to a lot of other rear-wheel drive cars also helps a lot with this. If you struggle to keep grip in rear-wheel drive cars, well, I do have a video on that, but you should test out a lot of those theories and get some practice in this car. It really is one of the easiest rear-wheel drive cars to drive. And speaking of struggling to keep grip, let's move into our S1 track spec build. For this build, I did want to focus on maxing out power while still trying to tame it as much as possible through the tune. We'll still be keeping the rear-wheel drive layout, but power is gonna start overtaking grip here, so good throttle management will be a must. We've gone with a lot of power mods here, including the max upgraded cams to bring the power to 696 horsepower. We have left the twin turbos stock though, which helps keep the power band smooth with this much power. We have had to go with the Forza rear wing as well, which you can see doesn't actually look that bad on the Supra, but we needed that to increase the rear downforce in order to keep those rear tires gripped up. We also have full weight reduction and chassis stiffness with the roll cage, and are running race brakes as well. There were a lot of different ways I could have gone with this build. You can actually switch to the single turbo, max out power at over 1600, but just not max upgrade your tires and some other things and still stay in S1. If you're very good at throttle management, it's actually kind of drivable too. I didn't want to do this though because I want to focus more on realistic builds and cars that anybody can hop in and drive well. And that's exactly what this S1 build does. You can actually see from the two numbers that not much has changed from our A-Class setup. Surprisingly, after upgrading the mods to S1 and taking the car out with just the A-Class build, it drove really well. There were of course some adjustments that needed to be made with all of this extra power and different suspension, different brakes, different weight, but overall this is really just a slightly tweaked A-Class tune. Now there's definitely some more adjustment that can be done here. Like I said earlier, these are all rough draft builds, but I wanted to get them out there so that you guys had the chance to drive these cars and build them up how you want to, and then I will of course be publishing some more final draft tunes later on once I've had a lot more time with the cars. Back to our S1 setup here though, it really just feels like a faster version of the A-Class build. It's a bit less oversteer prone and has a bit less turn in because I did need to rein in that extra power even more to prevent excessive oversteer, but realistically the car still handles very well and has a good bit of turn in, especially if you follow a good racing line. Now let's move away from track builds and focus on the Supra's other strength, drifting. Now first things first, keep in mind for this footage that it is winter and the car is going to look a lot less grippy than it normally would be in different weather conditions. But with that aside, this is really one of the best drift cars in the game, if not the best. Like I mentioned earlier, the 2J with the single turbo can reach just over 1600 horsepower, so power is not an issue for this build. From my understanding, the FD car pack has slightly more steering angle than all the other cars in the game, even if you have the drift suspension equipped, but maybe that's not the case because it didn't feel like angle was an issue with this build either. Everything just comes together so well in this car to make a phenomenal drift setup. The wheelbase feels perfect, the amount of power is obviously more than adequate, and the suspension setup and weight balance just makes it so easy to adjust your drift however you want to. As for the build, I haven't done much that you wouldn't expect. Pretty much everything is maxed out as far as mods go, and the tune is just my pretty standard go-to drift setup without any drift gearing. I usually go with shorter gears, but since there's so much power and mid-range torque here, you just don't really need those short gears to keep the revs up, and having the slightly longer gears can help to extend your drifts. Well guys, that just about does it for this guide on the Supra. We've gone over some history on the car and given 4 different builds for it. I hope this gives you some good appreciation for where the car comes from and why it's so popular, and I hope those tunes give you all a good starting point for when you get your own Supra in the game. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.